I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am your host, Jesse Lawler, here to bring you the 22nd episode of this podcast, which focuses, as you know, on the continuing battle for the betterment of your own brain by any and all means necessary. We are here, first of all, I should tell you, as I record this, it is Halloween, and we're going to have a special Halloween sort of episode with, none of the traditional ghosts and goblins and scary music, unless my editor decides to put that in right here, but we are going to talk about a scary chemical, or a chemical that we've all been taught to believe is really scary, but today we're going to examine whether underneath that scary exterior there might be just like a cute little kid that wants, some trick-or-treat candy, and it's about as far as I can stretch that analogy, but we're going to be talking about nicotine today. Why are we talking about nicotine on a Smart Drugs Nootropics-y podcast? What does nicotine possibly have to do with any of this stuff? Well, it turns out that despite its nasty reputation and its obvious going hand in hand in the popular imagination with tobacco, which has a lot of crummy things about it, nicotine itself actually might not be the villain that it's sort of been made out to be. But before we vector completely off topic when the podcast has barely started, let me bait you with the ruthless listener retention gimmick at the end of this episode, where we're going to talk about something which is probably kind of sitting underutilized in your spice rack right now, but possibly deserves a place in your medicine cabinet as well, based on what it might be able to do for your brain in the thwarting and prevention of Alzheimer's disease. So that at the end of the episode. In news that will not help your health in any way, shape, or form, or improve your memory, but is something that I like to remember, is I got 3 5-star reviews since the last episode on iTunes. Got one from Tom Pencer, who says he recently discovered the show and really enjoyed it. He pinged me for not having a consistent publishing schedule, and he's exactly right. And sorry about that, Tom. I'm working on it, man. Doc Meehan says, great coverage of an important topic. I'm a physician that began using a number of nutritional and nootropic approaches for optimizing brain function while I was in medical school. I was guided by the work of Morgenthaler and Dr. Dean, the authors of Smart Drugs and Nutrients. I was pleased to listen to Dr. Dean during one of your early podcasts. In fact, that was podcast number 1. He goes on to say that the science of nootropics is something that few physicians understand or promote, and that he's glad that Mr. Lawler, that's me, is doing a great job providing more coverage of this interesting topic. In fact, Jesse has inspired me to renew my personal program and once again sharpen my most important tool, my brain. And finally got a great review from somebody with an internet handle that defies all attempts at pronunciation. But he says that this podcast has been a great source of information. Diving into the legal aspects of acquiring and possessing your own smart drugs is something many smart drug forums may skirt around or altogether ignore. But episode 16 puts all this dirty laundry out for all to see and understand. Jesse is articulate, asking the right questions with his interviews, and his motivation in the area of nootropics is contagious. Thank you to everybody that wrote in there. Yeah, really appreciate that. And speaking of appreciation, I got a very appreciative email also from Ben over at naturalstacks.com. You remember Natural Stacks were the guys that are releasing the Siltep product that we talked with a couple of weeks ago. This was Abelard Lindsay and Roy Krebs. Anyway, Ben works with them. He said that they are extending their sort of opening salvo offer for visitors to the naturalstacks.com site, and that people that want to save $10 on an order that they place there can use the coupon code SDSmarts, and that's all in capitals. I'll put that on the website also. Let's hear about This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Okay, so this is an oldie but a worthwhiley. This is something that was sent to me by my dad, who is a giant health food nut, which probably started me down the road to being interested in all this sciencey sort of stuff in my youth. He sent me an article about good cholesterol being linked to better memory. What is good cholesterol, you might ask? That's the high-density lipoproteins, or HDLs, as opposed to the LDLs, which are the low-density lipoproteins that people are concerned will stick to the walls of your arteries and do the bad things that cholesterol sometimes has a reputation for doing. Now, as we've talked about, cholesterol, whether it's a friend or a foe, is sort of an open question, I think, within nutritional science at this point. But let me tell you the gist of this article. In the latest study in arteriosclerosis, thrombosis, and vascular biology, yes, that is actually the name of a magazine, this was a study of 3,673 men and women in a long-term study of British civil servants. They were measured twice at 6 years apart, ages 55 and 61. Participants were given a 20-word list to read of random words and were asked to write down as many words as they could remember within 2 minutes. Originally, there was no statistical significance between what the two groups with the low HDL and the high HDL could remember, but after 6 years, there was a statistical significance. The low HDL group did not do as well on the memory test as the high HDL group, and moreover, the subjects whose HDL levels declined during the 5-year interval were more likely to show a decline in memory performance. Neither the total cholesterol levels nor the triglyceride levels had any association with memory performance, and there was also no evidence of interaction with a known genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's. The researchers are not sure what the mechanism of action is here that might lead to the correspondence between HDL levels and memory, but they were willing to speculate that HDL might protect cognitive function by reducing risk factors for stroke and vascular disease, or that HDL could affect beta amyloid, which is associated with plaque in the brain. Other possibilities include anti-inflammatory effects or antioxidant effects on the degeneration of the brain's neurons. Most applicable to you is what you can do to keep your own HDL levels healthy, and they said that the easiest ways to do that are to avoid tobacco, which is apropos to this week's episode, and also to avoid trans fats and generally losing weight. Factors thought to boost HDL include exercise, moderate or no consumption of alcohol, and the intake of soluble dietary fibers such as oats, vegetables, fruits, and legumes. So there we go with a very nutritional episode of This Week in Neuroscience. This is actually October of 2008, so several Octobers ago in neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so with a little bit of preamble for this interview, I should say, I guess going in, that I'm a 100% nicotine naive individual. I've never smoked a cigarette. I had a grandfather who smoked like 3 packs a day, and early in my youth was just like, I totally, gagged on that smell so often just hanging around him. I've steered clear of it every chance I've gotten for the rest of my life thereafter. So yeah, didn't really know anything about nicotine, certainly not as a nootropic, but over the course of the past few months, I've been getting more and more emails asking about this particular issue, people that are using Nicorette gum or nicotine patches or things like that, not so they can quit smoking, but to get a cognitive boost from it. One of the emails sent me a link to a site called Guern.net that had a really, really thorough article, which was sort of like a synopsis of one guy's studies into the use of nicotine as a nootropic. Tons of original sources, really interesting stuff, and reading that, I realized there was definitely the makings of a meaty podcast episode here. So let me just read you one little excerpt from that site. This is actually coming out of the ADHD Review of 2011, and I quote, "Dozens of studies have assessed the effects of nicotine on cognition in healthy, nicotine-naive samples, including studies of memory, attention, and inhibitory control. In a recent meta-analysis of 48 studies in which nicotine was administered to non-smokers or only minimally deprived smokers, nicotine was shown to have positive effects on multiple domains, including attention and working memory. 29 studies specifically assessed non-smokers, and among those, positive effects were observed for reaction time on tests of sustained or alerting attention and working memory." So yeah, when I read that, I figured, we have a tiger by the tail here. Time to find an expert. The expert that got on this podcast is Dr. Neil Everett Grunberg of the Department of Medical and Clinical Psychology from the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. It's a bit of a tongue twister. He's definitely one of the leading minds in the study of nicotine, has been at it for years and is at it still, and had a ton of really interesting stuff to say. He wanted me to specifically mention that the opinions that he's going to give in the coming interview are his own opinions and do not necessarily represent either his university or any branch of the U.S. government or anything like that. These are his opinions and his opinions alone. However, they are definitely based on what learning that he's done over the last several decades of study. So with no further ado, here we go. Okay, so sort of by way of introduction, I've gotten a lot of emails in the last couple of months on people asking me about nicotine and its uses as a nootropic, potentially. Obviously, for most people, the first thing that comes to mind when you think nicotine is cigarettes and all the, the horrible health repercussions of smoking cigarettes. But having looked into it a little, it seems like, nicotine as a standalone drug within your body might not have all these, ridiculously awful consequences that its primary delivery mechanism in cigarettes has for people. So, you've got a ton of background in this. I would love to just kind of hear you riff on what you've learned in your studies of nicotine over the years.
I'd be happy to. Thanks for asking. I'm a psychologist and a psychobiologist and also a neuroscientist. I've been studying drugs and stress and drugs and behavior and the underlying mechanisms in the brain and body for about 35 years now. The focus that I've had on nicotine has included studies of nicotine and body weight, nicotine and attention, nicotine and stress, nicotine and co-use of other drugs, alcohol, etc., and it goes on like that. Now, with regard to your question, it's an excellent one because it needs to be framed. Most people, until recently, and I'll explain that in a moment, are receiving administering nicotine mostly through cigarettes. You can also get them through other smoked tobacco products, cigars, pipe smoking, etc. One can also get nicotine through chewing tobacco in non-smokeless form, smokeless tobacco. And now more and more over the last couple of decades, one can get nicotine in various other products that are designed for smoking cessation. Nicotine gum, nicotine patches, nicotine nasal spray, and even nicotine water. And it goes on, and nicotine lozenges. So to get it in context, Jesse, it's important to realize when one takes a puff on a cigarette, I mean, this is a staggering fact, you're actually inhaling 7,000 chemicals. Not a few dozen, not a few hundred, 7,000 differentially now identified. Now, until about 5 or 10 years ago, we would have said, oh, that's 4,000, a number we quoted for years. But it's become clear. Now, why are there so many products in that? Because not only does the cigarette itself contain hundreds and hundreds of chemicals, but due to pyrolysis, the burning procedure, burning creates new chemicals. I mean, all you have to do is think about, you put a toast in the toaster, your bread in the toaster. When you create toast, you don't only warm up the bread, charcoal and other chemicals are created. So I mention that because the self-administration of cigarette has to do with nicotine, which we'll get back to in a moment, and then thousands of chemicals, of which dozens to hundreds are incredibly harmful. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, nitrosamines, nitrogen alkylamines are just a few of the large drug classes that contribute to cancers, cardiovascular disease, lung diseases, and pulmonary diseases, as well as other abnormalities and health problems. Nicotine is fascinating for several reasons. It is the primary drug of addiction in tobacco, whatever form of tobacco, from chewing a tobacco leaf to smoking a cigarette. Even though there are thousands of the other chemicals, nicotine indeed has gotten the appropriate reputation, not only for being addictive, but it is, as far as we consider, one of the most, if not the most addictive drug known in the history of the world. Now, that's a very important point because people, again, have gotten misinformation about various other dangerous drugs, heroin, cocaine, etc. And many drugs that are used recreationally and can be damaging. The best example of this one I can think is LSD or PCP. These are not addictive drugs. Those drugs have psychological and psychopharmacologic actions, psychedelic actions, many of which can be very, very dangerous. But that doesn't mean that the body comes to require or need the material. Even if we take heroin and opiates which people think of as the most addictive drugs, if you give all sorts of people opiates, less than half of them actually become addicted. It has an addiction liability of about 40%. Nicotine, the addiction liability, is closer to 90%. Alcohol, the addiction liability, is approximately 10%. You follow me? So that if 100 people used it, how many would actually become addicted? And that's why I say nicotine's addiction liability is extraordinarily high. Okay, now, this gets into a decision that people make in terms of, is addiction bad? Now, if you're someone who believes that being dependent on, or if you will, and I'll use more colorful language, enslaved to a given drug for biological and psychological reasons is bad, then addiction is bad. If, however, you don't consider a drug bad unless it has physically harmful effects, right, or psychologically harmful effects. So think of it this way. You could say a drug is bad if it causes me to do harm to other people. Now, personally, I think that's bad. That's my moral view. Well, what drugs cause me to do harm to other people? Well, phencyclidine, PCP, is a very, very good example. But so are anabolic steroids. And in some people, depending on excessive consumption, so is alcohol. But nicotine does not do that. Now, I believe the judgment should be that use is bad if it harms me, does harm to me. Well, then again, we'd say alcohol can cause tremendous harm to self in excessive dose, but alcohol is complicated because moderation is actually good for you. Nicotine per se, that one chemical out of thousands, does very little damage to the body. Now, it does some damage. It increases what's called the autonomic nervous system, particularly the sympathetic nervous system branch, the fight or flight part of the response, releasing adrenaline or epinephrine. It's a stimulant. But that itself is not harmful. But nicotine used excessively or used regularly over time, nicotine per se, can cause vasoconstriction, that is a tightening or making your blood vessels smaller, which particularly if you have a genetic predisposition for a vascular disease, or if because of diet or genetics or other reasons you have occluded vessels, high levels of atherosclerosis, fatty tissue in your vessels, then nicotine's constriction of those garden hoses, if you will be bad and can increase the likelihood of peripheral vascular disease, blood flow problems, and stroke. However, if your vessels are fine, the constriction is no more than when you exercise hard. Now, nicotine, when used over many years, can cause another direct negative effect, and that is it looks like it can have an effect on the heart muscle, causing atrophy of the heart muscle, making it larger. Now, that's a funny one because at first making your heart muscles thicker or stronger sounds better, which it is. But they can actually thicken to a point where they don't work properly in synchrony with the other parts of your heart. That can happen. Now, I've just finished the list of the bad things due to nicotine. So, again, addiction per se, high liability, but addiction per se depends really on your judgment whether you think that is or is not bad for you.
Yeah, I mean, as far as that goes, you could say that we're all addicted to oxygen, but is that really something that has negative ramifications for us?
Well, we need food, we need oxygen, we need other things, and then we can even go into other things, not just as individuals, but as social animals. We are, if you will, we need social interaction to survive and be happy. We need physical and sexual interaction to survive as a species. So again, you can depend on it, but in that sense. But nicotine proper, the problem is that for now, the last century or so, particularly when cigarettes became constructed products, not like the more than 100 years ago. Nicotine use and chewing goes back millennia, goes back thousands and thousands of years. But when it was originally chewed from tobacco leaves, just like coca leaves were originally chewed for what later was extracted and purified as cocaine, the dosages were very, very low, and there were not the burning products. Then, again, thousands of years ago, the Native Americans of North and South America, but mostly North America, became well known for this, developed the smoking of tobacco as part of ritual and spiritual behaviors. That, again, had limited health hazard because it was nicotine in the plant naturally occurring. It had many other chemicals, but not all the hundreds of additives, which become thousands of burn products that the tobacco industry added over the course of the 20th century. But now we get to, that's a long preamble to your focused question, but it needs to be said in that context. Nicotine is a remarkable drug. Why has it been used so widely in the world? And why, unlike any other drug, nicotine has several unique qualities. One is, it is one drug that its use has never diminished in time or culture, regardless of what other recreational or drugs of addiction or pleasurable drugs
are introduced. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because when you think about other kind of like recreationally used drugs, one thing kind of goes into style as something else goes out of style. There's sort of a cyclicality to it, I guess.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's happened. And I could give you examples over hundreds of years, but not with tobacco or nicotine. It hasn't happened. The other thing that I find it, why, of all the drugs I've studied, which is many, many drugs, I find it by far, I say it's the most interesting drug in the world. It's the only drug that we know of, naturally occurring drug, that brings you up when you're down and brings you down when you're up. Now, this is a very important point. Most drugs drugs can be classified into whether or not they have action on the brain. They are psychopharmacologically active, which is different from, obviously, drugs and medications that work in the periphery, or antibiotics, or kill bacteria, or kill viruses, etc., or heal, or have peripheral analgesic effects, or on and on. But nicotine that gets into the brain because of the size and the physical chemistry of the molecule, readily crosses the blood-brain barrier and gets into the brain very quickly, especially when smoked, because any drug that's smoked, be it nicotine, cocaine, heroin, other drugs, inhalation through the lungs is the quickest way to get a drug to the brain, not by mainlining it, not by snorting it, not by any other way. Inhalation is by far the fastest way. Nicotine gets to the brain within seconds after an inhalation. But as I say, here's where it gets very interesting. If you're bummed out, if you're sluggish, if you don't have energy, nicotine will give you all that. But interestingly, if you are frenetic, if you're overly anxious, if you're highly stressed out, nicotine will calm you down. Same person. See, so this bimodal, or this bidirectional action makes it extremely pleasurable psychologically, and it's working through biological mechanisms. So now we get to the question that's really the focus, I believe, of interest to your listeners, and that is, can it help with cognitive processing, right? Or does it make you smarter? Well, evidence going back, and when I say evidence, I mean empirical, experimental studies, not just hearsay or testimonials, go back in this topic into the 1970s. But by the 1980s, the research literature is clear. Nicotine improves selective attention, the ability to focus on some things rather than others. It improves sustained attention, the ability to maintain attention to a given stimulus or situation. And it decreases distraction, the interference of information processing from other sources. Now, those are three related but distinct cognitive effects. It also seems to affect not only those aspects of attention, but something that's called pre-attentional processing, which is something we're not even aware of when we're not purposely paying attention, but it's our ability to detect information. So right away you have those direct cognitive actions. One of the reasons why, until the information on the health hazards of smoking became clear, and because the health hazards of smoking, notice I'm not saying nicotine, but smoking tobacco became clear, if you went into this is the best example I can think of, any newsroom in the United States, and so I'm in Washington, D.C., if you went down to the Washington Post, or I used to be in New York Times, these would be absolutely smoke-filled rooms. Why? Why do reporters smoke so heavily? Well, because most of them would tell you in those years, and some will still tell you today, they could not focus, think, and write on those remarkably short deadlines. And notice I'm mentioning some very famous newspapers, very competitive, high-quality, quick processing, without smoking. They couldn't do it. And a lot of people couldn't focus their attention. That's made it very difficult to help groups like that, individuals like that, have very focused attention, get off cigarettes. So now it comes to the really interesting question. In the late 1980s, and I had the honor and responsibility of being one of the senior scientific editors of the 1988 Surgeon General's report on smoking, which we entitled Nicotine Addiction. So I worked on that with my co-editors were Dr. Jack Henningfield, Dr. Neil Benowitz, and Dr. Harry Lando. But when we worked on that, we were given the task by then Surgeon General C. Everett Koop of not only providing more information about the health hazards. By the late 80s, it became pretty clear, starting in the early 60s, 70s, and 80s. But Dr. Koop said, why are people continuing to use this product despite all the health hazards? We went into that report with an open mind. We reviewed every piece of literature that we could find available. I personally read 3,500 articles to help write a 650-page report. What we found was, and we came out with the nicotine addiction report, this is where it gets real interesting for your listeners. When we determined that the data were unequivocal that nicotine itself was addictive, and it was that tobacco is addictive, but it's because of nicotine. That changed the world consumer, but in terms of physicians and healthcare professionals. In fact, we did a survey of physicians right before we issued the report in '88 to find out if you ask a physician, if a patient presents to you, and they do not have clearly tobacco-related symptoms or illness, do you ask them about their smoking, and do you encourage them to quit smoking? And 90+% of physicians before 1988 said, no, it's none of my business. And it's none of my business, they said, because it was free choice. What we did not expect is when we put together a report and looked at the entire scientific literature from around the world, a year after the '88 report, 90% of physicians completely changed their position and say, wait a minute, this is an addictive drug that's part of a product that's causing death and illness. We better bring it up, ask their patients. And then some years later, after what's called the Master Settlement Agreement, so after the tobacco industry first denounced these data, and then 10 years later admitted they were all correct, when even the tobacco industry said, okay, and if you go to the Philip Morris website, they're one of the clearest on this, tobacco is addictive because of nicotine's addictive. Now, all healthcare professionals realize that we should encourage people not to smoke or use tobacco products because it's deadly and addictive. But now we get to this interesting twist. Since 1988, and that understanding came out, the pharmaceutical industry then, as a consequence largely of our report, jumped on this tremendous niche and need, and that is new pharmaceuticals and new devices to help people quit smoking, but now they can focus on the drug nicotine. So they came out with all these various nicotine replacement strategies. Now, some people would argue, and still argue, that that's not morally sound because it's analogous to opiate treatment with methadone. You're treating one drug with another. Now, most of us think that's a good thing, but people who are against addiction per se would say you're still giving them the addictive drug. So whether the patient or the person use nicotine chewing gum, nicotine patch, nicotine gum, on and on and on, nicotine nasal spray, they're still getting the addictive drug nicotine, absolutely. But the only health risks we're aware of are addiction per se, and that's an interesting question. The cardiovascular effects I summarized earlier, peripheral vasoconstriction, and with very high dose over many years, perhaps some cardiac myopathy. But it makes you feel good. It focuses your attention. It brings you down when you're up. It brings you up when you're down. It helps you cope with stress and anxiety. And it helps perhaps with senile dementia, perhaps with Alzheimer's disease. Perhaps it would even help with cognitive problems due to traumatic brain injury or other problems. So I, for one, believe that nicotine and nicotine analogs, that means drugs that act like nicotine, not nicotine per se, should be the focus of substantial investigation as potential treatments, not only to help with cognitive processing, but particularly as we have an aging population, as well as people who have everything from attentional deficit disorder, right, to various dementias or other cognitive problems. Then if you're worried about the addiction, then one has the interesting individual choice of so I'm 60 years old right now, okay? But if you're dealing with a 60-year-old or a 70-year-old or an 80-year-old and your attention is going, should you be prescribing various nicotine products so it would help them with cognitive difficulty? And then the counter-argument is, well, no, it's addictive? Or is that really a counter-argument? Now, again, the cardiovascular problem should be assessed to see if someone has what's called Raynaud's disease, which is a peripheral vasoconstriction. Nicotine is likely exacerbating that and creating a problem. But if your cardiologist checks you out, should we be prescribing? Should we be putting, in the water supply, like we put in something that is a poison, fluoride? We fluoridate water supplies in the United States. Fluoride itself is a poison, but not in the low dose. It's the most effective chemical treatment to avoid dental caries. So it's a very interesting question, and I think something that should receive a lot of attention. There is substantial work going on, National Institute on Drug Abuse, as well as some investigators around the country look at it. It's not getting as much attention as I think it should. So your callers or people who have searched the net or who are interested in this possibility, this is a serious, positive, possible use of nicotine.
Wow, that is just a whole lot of information in one big monologue. Thank you so much for that. God, there's a lot of stuff that I want to circle back to here. One question, in sort of looking at the research, I noticed that it seems like there's been a lot of sort of studies of nicotine in the past 10 years or so, and a lot of some of the more positive findings have been coming out of that time period. And this is sort of since the big anti-tobacco legislation, massive, multi-billion-dollar penalties for all the big tobacco companies that happened, 15 or so years ago. Any correlation there?
Oh, sure. Well, I understand where you're going. That's a very good question. So, or let me tease it apart to make sure I'm parsing it correctly. There's been an increased study of nicotine's cognitive enhancing and positive effects over the last decade or so. I'm confident that many of them are funded by the National Institute of Health, public funds, others by foundations, and I presume, but I haven't looked into it, some are being funded by tobacco industry as well. And certainly, it's very, very likely that a substantial amount of research of this sort is being conducted within the tobacco industry, which would only make sense. But again, right now I'm speculating on that without looking up. Now, has there been an increase over the last decade? Well, I can be more exact. There's been an increase since 1988. I mean, very specifically, when we published the 1988 Surgeon General's report, we focused on nicotine. Before that, no government documents or reports that received a lot of attention focused so clearly on that drug. In fact, the original title of the 1988 report, when I came on board, the draft title was called The Health Consequences of Smoking, the Pharmacological Basis of Tobacco Use. A long and clunky title, which I and the other editors thought is not understandable and certainly was not modern late 20th century sound bites for the evening news. So then at one point we changed it to The Health Consequences of Smoking. Every one of the Surgeon General's reports have to be called that. And then the subtitle, Tobacco, Smoking, and Addiction or independent. But when we really looked at the data, we came down, and I'll never forget the day when we were having a meeting. We said, well, doesn't this come down to what we found is nicotine addiction? And then we checked with Surgeon General Koop, because he, of course, had to give final approval. And for such a brief, succinct, but clear message in the title, but also one that was potentially going to get a lot of reaction, positive and negative. Dr. Koop himself said, well, if that's what the data say, then, and my scientists and editors say that's what it should say, then that's what it should say. I bring that up, Jesse, because after that came out, and it was beaten up for a couple of years and fought about by the tobacco industry until they finally agreed. Once they agreed, it was then in the 90s when the research on positive effects, stress modification, weight control, which is what I became most famous for because my own doctoral dissertation in 1979 and established the effects of smoking and nicotine per se on weight management and appetite control. And then cognitive enhancement. All of that exploded in the 90s, but still federal dollars didn't get into it. That changed because in the late 90s, Eric Kandel, who's now in his early 80s, but a brilliant man and still clear, won the Nobel Prize sometime in the 80s for his work on the biological basis of learning theory. Brilliant man. He's at Columbia University School of College of Physicians and Surgeons. One of the founders of the field of neuroscience. The reason I'm bringing Dr. Kandel up is not only is he a brilliant scientist and great contributor, but Kandel himself, it was funny, as he aged, in the 90s, he actually broke off, left Columbia, and helped start a small pharmaceutical company to focus entirely on what you call smart drugs. Entirely. And because that was the first, I remember when it came out, because some people laughed about it. until they heard it was Candel who was behind it. When a Nobel laureate wants, and when I talked to I know Candel, and when I talked to him about it and said, Eric, this is amazing you're doing it, he said, well, Neil, I'm getting old and I want to figure out something to help myself, before I get too old. So he and others got interested in it. And I'm mentioning that, Jesse, because establishing the role of nicotine unequivocally in the late 80s, then Candel, and there were a few others, not many, but he was probably the most important because of his obvious credibility. As I remember, 3 to 5 different pharmaceutical companies, startups, were created in the 90s to focus on what we call cognitive enhancing drugs, what you obviously call smart drugs. So that got things going, but while people were searching to synthesize new pharmaceuticals, this group of scientists who were cognitive psychologists as well as pharmacologists, as they circled back, they found, wait, there's this chemical, that's been in manufactured products for 150 years, or 100 years at the time, and a product that's been around for millennia and studied for 100 years plus, nicotine, let's focus on it more. Which gets us to some of the interesting drugs like Chantix or Varenicline. So Chantix or Varenicline is a well-known smoking cessation aid. Very, very interesting drug because it is not nicotine. So it's not a nicotine, but it is what's called a partial agonist, partial antagonist. It's fascinating. It largely does what nicotine does in the brain while blocking the actions of nicotine if you introduce nicotine into your body. So as a result, it helps with the needs, the cravings for nicotine, and some of the other brain-based effects while not allowing nicotine itself to work. So that way, the smoker is encouraged to decrease the number of cigarettes, to decrease the amount of nicotine self-administration, then go on to Varenicline or Chantix, you see, to then completely get off cigarettes over the next few weeks or months or so, and then wean oneself off this drug itself. But I bring it up because the focus on Chantix and some of the other nicotine medications has been on helping as a smoking cessation guide, and there's only recently an attention are these other nicotine-related drugs providing cognitive enhancement. That's pretty new. That's a pretty new. And then you got to wonder, so should I right now, here I am working in my office at the university, writing papers, thinking, getting tired. Should I really go get a cup of coffee with caffeine, or should I have a bottle of nicotine adulterated water?
Yeah, see, that's what I was going to ask you, because you've got a son, possibly even grandkids.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Not yet, but I have 4 kids. But what am I going to see going to happen to them? I hope that U.S. society and culture is potentially maturing enough to look at real evidence and data. And therefore, I hope to see continued evolution of thoughtful pharmaceutical companies and tobacco industry and any other businesses with appropriate Food and Drug Administration, FDA oversight, will work to develop products that will enhance the human condition. Not only enhance our physical health, enhance our mental health, including our affect, our mood, depression, anxiety, etc., being the most common problems, and help us not only as we live these longer lives because of the miracles of the last 50 years of remarkable medical strides, artificial devices. If you and I can be having this discussion decades from now with artificial hearts and artificial limbs and artificial this and that, then isn't it about time that we also develop products that will enhance and keep us mentally alert as well? I think this is extremely important to advance. And again, I compliment you for providing a forum and an outlet to help educate people about these issues.
Oh, thank you so much. No, this is all stuff that I'm really interested in personally, and I just kind of figured that doing my learning in a public context through this podcast would A, be something that would be useful for other people, and B, kind of give me a better excuse to call up people like you and pepper you with questions. And okay, so here's something that, this might be a totally naive question, but is the easiest way to make nicotine, make the chemical nicotine now, still to grow it out of tobacco and derive it from plants, or is it something that is, could just as easily be made totally within a lab?
That's a very good question. And nicotine, because it's readily available in tobacco products, it's easily available. It can also be synthesized if one wants, if one decides to go that route. So, which is easier? That you'd have to ask of a physical chemist. And if you want, I could give you the name of probably the best nicotine chemist in the world. I think actually his name is Peyton Jacob, who's at the University of California, San Francisco. So both are possible. If you really want to break down which is easier, call Peyton Jacob, UCSF, tell him I sent you. I mean, the man knows more about nicotine chemistry, I should say, than anyone outside the tobacco industry. There are, obviously chemists who are experts within it. But that's an interesting question. But it's so readily available and easily grown and easily attained, but there's no problem getting it.
Okay, so last question. Somebody close to you, one of your kids, a close friend, says, hey, I've got a bunch of work coming up. I really want to, be able to zone in, get my alertness high, and I'm thinking about smoking a couple of e-cigarettes to help me with this task. Is that something? I mean, do you have any reservations if it was somebody close to you?
That's a terrific question. I've been asked that before. E-cigarettes is an interesting other sidebar, because if e-cigarettes only provided nicotine and nicotine fumes only, then that's a very interesting and potentially valuable source of nicotine. What I'm not clear, I have not seen clear evidence of what other chemicals are being produced or presented with e-cigarettes. So unless we know all of the gases, the issue, it's hard to know about its health hazard or not. Second, with regard to e-cigarettes, they're designed and marketed currently to help people quit smoking. There is the possibility, a substantial possibility, if people started on e-cigarettes, they'd become addicted. And if they become addicted, they might then progress to the more dangerous tobacco cigarettes. So there's the issue there. So, e-cigarettes are, in my mind, safer than tobacco cigarettes. But if we're asking about suggesting to someone if they really needed a stimulant, some nicotine gum, some nicotine water, perhaps a nicotine lozenge, I would put in a similar category with moderate amounts of caffeine. So that moderate amounts of caffeine are also alerting and help, both alerting in terms of arousal, avoiding sleep, as well as focusing attention. But people dangerously overdo it with caffeine because of the various heavily caffeinated beverages. I'm not going to use a brand name because I'm not looking to criticize one or another in particular. But the heavy caffeinated beverages are being used in excess. Although they may say drink 1 can with water, people will drink 2, 3, 4, 6 cans or something, or multiple cans, and also take caffeine pills. And they're getting grams and grams of caffeine rather than hundreds of milligrams. So the jury's out right now, Jesse, with regard to the danger. I predict that over the next few years it will become more clear, and there will likely be a lot of arguments for nicotine or nicotine-related drugs that are cognitive enhancers to help people stay awake when they're driving, to help safely, to help students when they're studying. Certainly they rather use nicotine lozenge, gum, or water than use various amphetamines, which are highly addictive and dangerous. So if we had to create that hierarchy, of danger, nicotine and caffeine, I'd put close together with regard to the cost-benefit analysis for cognitive enhancement right now. But there has not been, as far as I know, what's called a head-to-head trial, really carefully comparing dosages, amounts, and side effects. But I can tell you as a sidebar, we're very interested because I work with military personnel and do research related to the health of our warfighters and the like, is my laboratory is very interested in what's the relationship between nicotine, caffeine, either to help or to hurt with regard to post-traumatic stress disorder. And we have various ideas and studies ongoing about this. So this is a new burgeoning area. I wouldn't run to the store and start buying nicotine water yet. But I wish people could. Preferably people should do without the medications and drugs. But clearly there are many times psychopharmacologic drugs. But there are many times they can enhance and help. They're near magical when helping people from major mental health disorders or helping over difficult times. And cognitive enhancement or safety. Would I rather my kid drive sleep deprived at 3 o'clock in the morning at 500 miles between college and home, Or would I rather they do it and be chewing some nicotine gum? Well, probably pretty easy to guess what my answer is. I'd rather they had this, the balance of safety and attention.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's always going to be a trade-off. Well, thank you so much for the interview. Really informative and interesting stuff. I think the audience is really going to love it and really appreciate your joining us.
All right. Thanks, Jess.
So a very big thanks to Dr. Grunberg for an informative and really interesting interview. I was very excited about the interview afterwards. I just thought that Grunberg was a really engaging speaker, and I was telling a friend of mine about it, and he said, "Oh, yeah, nicotine. Well, it's a lot like cocaine." And that didn't really help me either. I still had absolutely no frame of reference. But for those of you out there in the audience who are experienced with cocaine but are not yet experienced with nicotine, that might be something to set your expectations a little bit. On the other hand, I'm kind of assuming that the number of people who have cocaine experience but do not have nicotine experience is a very, very, very small subset of the population. But moving right along, let's do the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So as I mentioned, there is something that might be hiding in your spice rack, maybe not getting as much use on your dinner plate as it deserves, that could be a neuroprotective agent as far as protecting you from Alzheimer's disease, or even, if you happen to already have Alzheimer's disease, making it not quite so debilitating and making you so dementia-ridden. I'm assuming not too many actual Alzheimer's patients are listening to this podcast, but maybe somebody has a family member or something. Anyway, so here's what I'm getting at. The mystery spice in question is turmeric. It is an Indian spice. You've probably had it before. Maybe you think of it in the same family as like paprika or something. I can't really describe exactly what it tastes like, except that it tastes like Indian food. And it's apparently something that has been a heavy-duty staple of the Indian cooking diet for as much as 5,000 years, give or take. And India, among the many things you can say about that country, it has a comparatively low Alzheimer's rate in its population. This is both for city-dwelling and rural-dwelling Indian people. And they think that actually the heavy use of turmeric might be part of that. Among the anti-Alzheimer's mechanisms that are known to exist in turmeric, it is an anti-inflammatory, it is an antioxidative, which would make it an antioxidant. It is an anti-cytotoxic, that's talking about the cytoplasm within the cells, for those of you biology geeks. It is an anti-amyloidogenic. I'll leave you to look up what that actually means. It is a neurorestorative. Turmeric, apparently the active ingredient is one of the curcuminoid family, and curcuminoids appear to rescue long-term potentiation. Yes, that's long-term potentiation, a throwback to last week's Siltep episode. But yeah, if long-term potentiation has been impaired by amyloid peptide, curcuminoids such as turmeric may reverse physiological damage by restoring distorted neurites and disrupting existing plaques, or so I'm told. And finally, turmeric has metal chelating properties. Chelation is your body's biological way of getting heavy metals that have snuck into your system out of your system. There's